Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I promise to have a follow-up of what is happening with the South African elections. I think all those who can, Zimbabweans who can follow those elections, there is a lot for us to learn here. If we are serious about holding free, fair, and credible elections, we have got to look at what South Africa is doing, and we've got to do the same thing. This is a video of a police officer, senior police officer, addressing his staff regarding these coming elections. So just listen to it and I'll comment on it.
As much as you love a political party, but remember, you can only be loyal to the badge, because it doesn't matter who's in charge of this country. There shall be a South African police service beyond the elections. The Constitution says so. The Police Act have appointed each one of you. You are not being voted to be in a position, so you shall remain as a law enforcement officer in charge of that unit, that station, wherever you're working, the district, and you are serving the badge, and you are loyal to the national flag. And the reality is you are a police officer. You are a civil servant. You shall serve, it doesn't matter who. If any other party takes over this government in this province of KwaZulu-Natal, you will serve them, and you will obey the directives that come from that political party. If your heart tells you, I want this party to be in charge, go and vote for that party. It's your right. But when that party loses, it doesn't mean that you must be upset about it. You can't put it into your heart because you're a civil servant.
This must be seen in the light of Zimbabwe. A few years ago, the then police commissioner, Augustine Chihuri, wrote his thesis, doctorate, PhD thesis. And the topic was the challenges of policing in post-independent Zimbabwe. And in his thesis, he made no secret that the biggest challenge for the Zimbabwe Republic Police, and he was the commissioner, the commanding, the most senior police officer in the land. And as far as he was concerned, the biggest challenge was to stop the West and their puppets who were hell-bent on imposing regime change in Zimbabwe. That, to him, was the biggest challenge for the police. And so the whole policing in Zimbabwe, ever since the country's independence, has premised on that idea that the opposition are puppets of the West who are hell-bent on imposing regime change. And it is the duty of the police to make sure that they do not succeed. And so the policing in Zimbabwe has been based on that idea. And so it has been normal for the police to disrupt any opposition activities as much as possible. It's normal for the opposition to be denied the right to hold rallies, to be harassed wherever they go. And Police Commissioner Chihuri was not apologetic about that. He was proud of it. And when you look at Zimbabwe's history, political history, it is the history of how the police has been working for Zanu PF to stop regime change. It is quite normal for the police in Zimbabwe to turn a blind eye to Zanu PF leaders and supporters harassing the opposition, beating them up, and even killing them. And indeed, in 2008, the police joined forces with other armed services like the army, the CIO, in Operation Mavhotera Papi, in which the army, the police, the CIO, Zanu PF operatives conducted wanton violence to punish the Zimbabwean populace for having rejected Zanu PF in the March 2008 election. The police were heavily involved in that. Zanu PF changed Zimbabwe's security services. Mugabe co-opted the army, the police, the CIO, the prison services, the top brass in those sectors to save Zanu PF by creating this joint operation command. And all it is a junta that had the power, the real power behind Zanu PF. And the junta came to its own in 2008 in the Operation Mavhotera Papi. And it was a result of that Zanu PF managed to retain power. And Mugabe is rewarded the top brass by granting them mining concessions, particularly in Marange and in Chiazwa. And hence the start of the rampant corruption. The top brass have got an invested interest in maintaining the status quo in Zimbabwe. And ever since 2008, they have committed themselves to that. It was shocking to the nation when people like Augustine Chihuri, particularly in 2008, came out clearly and said they were not going to salute anyone who doesn't have a liberation war credentials. Those in the army said the same thing, CIO the same thing. This is where the contrast comes in with what is happening in South Africa. In South Africa, as you heard the commanding officer telling his subordinates that you save all South Africans. Well, you have got the right to go and vote for whatever party you want. You've got to remember that at the end of the day, whoever wins, you are loyal to them. You save the badge. The Constitution is very clear. The police should be non-partisan. And the commitment is there. In Zimbabwe, it is not there. Zanu PF has set out to corrupt the country's democratic institutions, including the police, the army, the CIO. the judiciary, etc., etc. But it is important that I should also mention that Zimbabwe had the golden opportunity to end this situation. The 2008 to 2013 Government of National Unity, the GNU, was the golden opportunity for Zimbabwe to implement the democratic reforms which would have entered Zanu PF control of the police, the army, etc. We cannot deny that that golden opportunity was wasted. Mugabe bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends, and they forgot about the reforms. MDC, Triple C have been participating in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that the police was acting in a non-partisan manner. They made a big song and dance about it, but they were only paying lip service to it. The commitment was not there. They were willing to participate in flawed election even when the police were constantly harassing the opposition. Constantly. And yet they still maintained that the opposition would win the elections. Why? Because they were interested in the few gravy train seats that Zanu PF was offering the opposition for participating. It is for the same gravy train seats that the opposition failed to implement even one meaningful reform. So I would want to emphasize the importance here that while we are fighting to have democratic elections in Zimbabwe, we must also appreciate that as long as we have got an opposition leaders like Nelson Chamisa, there will be no free, fair, and credible elections in Zimbabwe. Because if they fail to implement even one meaningful democratic reform during the GNU, it is naive to think they'll do so now. The people of Zimbabwe have got to wake up to the reality that the opposition is no longer fighting in the ordinary people's corner. They have decided they will cooperate with Zanu PF for the benefit of the few gravy train seats that the regime gives them. Our fight for free, fair, and credible elections in Zimbabwe means, therefore, we've got to fight Zanu PF, but also we've got to accept that the present opposition leaders are not fighting in our corner. As much as we would want them to fight in our corner, they are not. They failed to implement even one reform in 23 years, including 5 during the GNU. It is naive to think they can still implement those reforms. They are not going to do it. And so we need to wake up to the reality that we need a competent opposition that will stand up firm on reforms that will mean the police are finally independent of the controls of Zanu PF. Not only the police, but the army, the CIO, the judiciary, etc., etc. These democratic reforms must be carried out. And to have an opposition that is willing to participate in these flawed elections because they know they get a share of the spoils of power. If we do not wake up to that reality, I think we'll never have free, fair, credible elections in Zimbabwe. And that is the tragedy. And before I close, I would once again urge Zimbabweans to really take an active interest in what is happening in South Africa. Because I think South Africa is going to once again hold free, fair, and credible elections. They've done so in the last 30 years. Not even one opposition party has ever that the police or other security organs of the state were acting in a partisan manner. That is what we want. That is what it should be in a free, fair, credible election. And we have got to take note of that. And therefore, then it is important that people of Zimbabwe should really sit up and pay attention to what is happening in South Africa. The commitment, the level of commitment to making sure that the elections are free, fair, and credible in South Africa is something South Africans themselves are proud of, and rightly so too. And we will be doing ourselves a great service by paying attention and making sure that we replicate those things in Zimbabwe too. We demand those things should happen in Zimbabwe too. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.